Yeah, we are on page 134. And we'll be taking up verse 6. Yastu sarvani bhutani atmaneva anupashyati sarva bhuteshu chatmanam tato na vijuguptase. But he who sees everywhere the self in all existences and all existences in the self shrinks not thereafter from aught. If you see the rhythm that has been followed, the first two verses were a general cosmic vision telling us about the Supreme Lord who is pervading the whole universe. And then the way it is linked up is that this Supreme Lord is the one for whom we should be verily wanting to live 100 years. But the secret of that living for 100 years was, of course, as I said, by detachment, not cleaving to the material objects or to anything. So it was a kind of a preview of what is going to come, the divine and the divine life. So in two verses, they cover almost the essence of what we want to have a divine life. Then the verse 3 and 4 we have seen is again the details of the nature of the divine. In what way we see that standing passes beyond others as they run, that's the master of life, etc. is again to emphasize the omnipotence, omniscience, omnipresence of the divine. And there is one little hint in verse 3. That means wherever we do not have this connection with the divine, whenever we do not feel this connection, we are living in a dark world. So you see, the only purpose and meaning of life and the way to live a full life is to be constantly connected with the divine through all things, through everything. And whenever there is a disconnect, like we see even electricity, when there is a switch off, there is darkness. So that switching off is the disconnectedness. So the whole effort of life is constantly to be connected with the divine, and that is where we live in a world what we call in the religious manner heaven, paradise. In reality, there is no such thing as heaven and paradise and hell and all that. It's a state of our consciousness. So constantly, in every minute or every hour of the day, we may be in heaven or in hell, depending upon our own level of consciousness. And then having said that, in verses 3, 4, 5, actually, not just 3, 4, 5, then we move to a verse which is now coming closer to the Vedantic philosophy of life. Life in the sense, Vedantic philosophy, as you have seen by now, at least got a hint, Right in the beginning was we say, all this is for the habitation by the Lord. So this oneness of the divine is now beautifully emphasized. Oneness of the divine means is not the oneness with the divine, but the divine is verily everything. Even in this manyness, it is an apparent manyness, it is an ignorance to see the manyness actually. So Vedanta's greatest emphasis is that all is in one and one is in all. The one in the many and the many in the one, and the one as the many. That's the triple formula of the Vedanta. One in many, many in one, and one as the many. Because mostly people do not think one as the many. There is a disconnect, but the Vedantas has this triple formula. So, keeping this base now, is it just philosophy or is it practicable? That this question of really everything is the divine. It does require a high level of consciousness, I understand. But Sri Aurobindo here has magnificently brought out in this next couple of pages. One of the most beautiful pages I have come across on the practical reality or the practicability of this Vedanta. What happens? What is the effect on our life? Is it just philosophy to say that all is divine, everything is divine? But here is a magnificent para which I would like to read out and begin with page 134. The Guru says, if you really understand, then you are ready for the next step which the Shruti takes when it draws from the unity of the Brahman the sublimest moral principle to be found in any religion. Imagine Sri Aurobindo saying, it is a moral principle, but it's a moral principle not made made by the mind. Moral principles in the sense that it is a principle that could be practiced on our day-to-day existence. So, and then it beautifully says it's the most profound one that you can find in any religion. What is it? Well, we read that verse, Yastu Sarvani Bhutani, etc. To man finding himself in the midst of the paradoxes created by the twofold nature of the self, of himself, the Shakti that knows and the Shakti that plays at not knowing, the Shruti gives an unfailing guide, a sure staff and a perfect ideal. Now what is this verse? What is the major thing? See all creatures in thyself. That was the basic thing we saw here. But he who sees everywhere the self. So what happens? See all creatures in thyself. Yes, all. Wife, children, friends, enemies, joy, sorrow, victory, defeat, beauty and ugliness, animation and inanimation. All these are but moods of the one consciousness, and that consciousness is our own. You see, the thing that we should understand is that this one consciousness of the divine, well, in Sri Aurobindo and the Mother everywhere, this emphasis is there. This one consciousness of the divine is not an objective, impersonal consciousness. You see, in Sri Aurobindo and the Mother, there is a kind, if I can pronounce daringly, The divinity is outside, the divinity is an objective divinity, the divinity is transcendental, universal, where of course in individual you call it psychic and Atman. But the Vedanta doesn't go into this side. For the Vedanta, the divine, the outer and the inner are inseparably one. When we say, psychic being and Brahman, that's fine. But the uniqueness of Vedanta seems to be that this absolute emphasis that you, Tattvamasi, Aham Brahmasmi. I mean, this word Aham Brahmasmi, that I am verily the Brahman, is the essence of the Vedanta. It's the essence of Sri Aurobindo also. But in Sri Aurobindo it gets a little dispersed, if not diluted. But here in this terse word Aham Brahmasmi Tattvamasi, that thou art that, I am the Brahman. You see what a daring thing, I am the Brahman. So you can see the constant emphasis that me and the Brahman are one and the same. So you see here, yes, everything is He. These are all different moods of one consciousness, and that consciousness is our own. What is it? If you come to think of it, you have no friends or enemies, no joys or sorrows, but of your own making. And you will see the word that all these things of your own making. You don't blame the other for anything. And as the advantage that we get in Sri Aurobindo and the mother is that the same truth is seen from a psychological point of view, where they bring in the question of the ego, your ego getting hurt, as the mother would say, they are the mirror, etc. But philosophically, all these relations, friends, etc., sorrow and joy also is of your own making. Why? Scientists tell you that it is by the will to adapt itself in a particular way to its surroundings, one species differentiates itself from another. A beautiful example. We have this great philosopher, what's his name, Darwin, who has told us in scientific terms that most of these animals, there is an evolution because there is as he puts it here, there is a will to adapt itself. The famous example of the zebra and the giraffe, that say for example there are no leaves down in the trunk of the tree, the leaves are very high up. So maybe that zebra type of animal went on adapting itself, pushing its neck higher and longer, and over maybe a century it developed a kind of a longish neck to adapt itself. So where there is a will to adapt, you can become that new will. And so Sri Aurobindo uses the same image to say that is but one application of an universal principle. The will is the root of all things. You will to have wife and children, friends and enemies, and they arise. You will to be sick and sorrow, and sickness and sorrow seize you. You will to be strong and beautiful and happy, and the world becomes brighter with your radiance. This whole universe is but the result of one universal will, which having resolved to create multitude in itself, has made itself into all the forms you see within it. I mean, it's pretty shocking. I mean, in the sense you can see, it's all our own will, our own doing. How does it trace it? You see how beautifully he traces it back to that origin of that consciousness, one consciousness, where we said that one consciousness willed to be many. Not wanted, of course we say the one wanted to be the many, but the wanted is the meaning of the will. So basically the whole concept is that he says here, you see, you will to have wife and children, friends and enemies, and they arise. It is your will that you want to get married, you want to have children, you want to have, It's the wanting, desiring, willing. And there, just like the original will created the many, our will also creates that relation, that wife, that children, that friends. So that is why we are told, I suppose, not to desire. Now we understand the word, why not to desire? Even to desire a friend, to desire an enemy, to desire a wife, to desire a child. He says, if we may think it to be natural, oh, you are getting to be 25, 30, you should get married. It's not the question of getting married. Somebody has pushed a will into you and say, hey boy, you are now 30, it's time. So that will, that desire is born in you, and that born, you can see, I've seen it plenty of time when you want to buy a thing, you want to buy a TV, you want to buy a car. How slowly the little desire, passing desire of, oh, if only I had a car, it becomes how strong it becomes. Then the desire becomes a will, then you procure money, you borrow money, you do anything you want to, you have to, but you manifest that desire. And then this is a psychological thing where it says, you will to be sick and sorrow, and sickness and sorrow seize you. I've seen many people, not many, I know a few people who love to be sick, who want to be sick. The moment they are sick, they telephone me, oh, Anand Dada, I'm not well. They take a pleasure in reporting to me that they have visited this hospital, this doctor has given me these injections, for 6 days I was in ICU. There is a joy, there is a pleasure, there is a will, as Shweta puts it beautifully. You will to be sick and sorry, and sickness and sorrow seize you. I've seen people enjoy being sick, and all is in the mind, as we see. Now we understand why the mind has such a great role in sickness. The moment you say, oh, I'm not well enough, and there you see, next moment you have fever, next moment you have backache. So the next sentence is, you will to be strong and beautiful and happy, and the world becomes brighter with your radiance. What we in our modern language call the positive attitude, the positive thinking. But Vedanta told you long million years back, this question of positive thinking, nothing new. This question of willing. You will to be sick, you are sick. You want to be healthy, you are healthy. You want to be happy and beautiful, you will be. Because there is, behind your will, remember, there is the one will. All this you can, and you are doing that because there is the supreme will which has become the many wills in you and you and you and me. So it's the same will that is acting. If I say, no, I will not be sick. I've seen many times when there's a lot of work, I say, sorry body, you will not fall ill. Maybe 6 days, 7 days, 10 days, you are working at zenith. No question of headache and fever. After the event, the will drops. So, wow, now the event is over. And next day you have a headache, you have a backache, and say, all these days I didn't have. That's the will that is pushing out. So, you push your will to be sorry and sick, or happy and beautiful. So, this whole universe is but the result of one universal will. The student, the idea is difficult to grasp, too vast and yet too subtle. The Guru. Because avidya, the sense of difference, is your natural condition in the body. Think a little. The body is built by the protoplasm multiplying itself. It does not divide itself, for by division it could not grow. It produces another itself out of itself. The same in appearance, in size, in nature, and so it builds up the body which is only itself multiplied in itself. Take that as an imperfect example which may yet help you to understand. This is again quite a foundational idea. The way Sri Aurobindo deals here with, these are all very fundamental philosophic, metaphysical ideas. You see, the very fact that we see the world in division is basically our avidya, is our ignorance. He says, okay, let me explain to you. I mean, it's really a good teacher, Shwam, takes it up. He says, think a little. And what is it? Let's take the example of protoplasm. You see, in my classes in biology many years back, I don't know, it was 64, we were given the idea that how does a child grow or develop or increase in the embryo. It is not one cell dividing itself into two. It is one cell multiplying itself. So cell 1 and cell 2 and cell 3 and cell 10, they are all the same. But if the volume increases, the volume of the embryo or this or the thing is, there is no division, but there is a multiplication of the same nature. What does Shwabanda want to tell us from this? Let's see the next explanation. But it multiplies not in itself, but out of itself, as a man and woman create a son out of themselves, the Guru. So it appears to you because it is working in time and space. For the same reason that there seem to you to be many Jivatmans outside each other, while deeper knowledge shows you one only, or that you imagine two separate consciousnesses in one man, while more skillful hypnosis shows you that they are one consciousness working variously within itself. So here we see the student says, so is it this multiplication is like a man and woman producing the child? He says, yes, you think it is like that 1 + 1, man and woman producing the third. But there is no third, there is no one, there is no two. There is only the Supreme One. He says, this is our ignorance to say man and woman and child. This multiplicity, this division itself is a wrong perception. Because there is actually in the height of height, there is only one consciousness, which apparently seems to be different, as he puts it elsewhere, for the purpose of the play. You see, that word for the purpose of the play is of tremendous importance. You see, when we were in the ashram, we had, say, group D, group C, whatever, we had, 30, 40 people in one group. And then we said, okay, today we are going to have basketball. So that one group, which is called group D, now gets divided into two to play basketball, that now you are my enemy. After 55 minutes or 1 hour, 25 minutes, we are back into group, we are back to friends. But for that 1 hour, for the sake of the play, somebody has to win, somebody has to lose, somebody is an enemy, somebody is a friend. So this, for the sake of the play, there is apparent division. But actually it's group D, only one D. Tomorrow maybe you are in my group and she is in the other group, and yesterday we were enemies but today we are friends. So really is there a division? No, it's for the sake of a play. There's all these things happening. We are enemies, we are friends, we are Pakistanis, we are Indians, we are Americans, we are Germans. So he says all this is an external nonsense. So do not really go by that. So he says, in one sense, the one seems to us to multiply himself like the protoplasm, because the one Jivatman is the same in all. Hence the fundamental similarity of consciousness in all beings. In one sense, he seems to divide himself like the human consciousness, because he is the unit and all seem to be partial expressions of the comprehensive unit. This goes on. Now let me stop here. It says, in one sense, the one seems to us to multiply himself like the protoplasm, because the one Jivatman is the same in all. You see, this is the real truth, that when we think that this protoplasm which multiplied itself, having the same consciousness, the same particles, So also is telling us that the same Brahman, that the same divine has multiplied in each one of us. He has not divided, it is not Brahman minus 22 million people makes this world, and so this is not Brahman plus. So each one of us is a full Brahman. That's the mystery of the whole thing. That's what is incredible to understand. Like the protoplasm, there are 10 million protoplasms, but each protoplasm is the same, is full, is not divided. So I can say, Aham Brahman, I am the one. So we see the meaning of that Aham Brahmasmi is this. I am Brahman, you are Brahman, you are Brahman, every one of us is the full Brahman. So, it says, hence the fundamental similarity of consciousness in all beings. In one sense, he seems to divide himself like the human consciousness because he is the unit and all seem to be partial expressions of the comprehensive unit. Yes, there is a sense of, we say, okay, we are all Brahman, but with a different character, the different name, with a different appearance and all that, for the sake of. But he says, this difference of name and form and character and personality is there in time and space. But beyond time and space, we don't have this form, we don't have these differences, we don't have this thing. Everything becomes that one group D, the one consciousness. So he would say, again he seems to add pieces of himself together because you the consciousness who are he, add yourself to your wife, the consciousness who is again he, and become one, and so the process goes on till the Vyashti analysis in parts, you get this samashti or synthesis of all. Finally, he seems to subtract himself from himself, because as I have told you, each step in creation is a letting loose or separating of part from a wider entity. Well, it does seem to be a bit tricky, the whole language here, but basically it's this fundamental thing that in this play that we seem to get added to each other, we become friends with each other, we become wife and husband, then we produce it, then we get united on the physiological level, biological level, then we produce a child which is again the third one. So all these are actually apparent divisions. The real truth is, the ultimate truth, not only the real truth, the ultimate truth is that all these forms exist only in space and time for the sake of play. But once the play is over, it's gone back. But you will say, at least for the sake of the play, but during the play, we are enemies, we are friends. Yes, truly, when I am saying playing a basketball match, I really hate in the sense I am his competitor, I want to really defeat him, I do everything, sometimes I do tricks, I even knock him down, we are fighting, we kill each other, because that is the reality of the play. And the emotions, when victory, when all this money, everything plays. But then he says, during the play everything is real, because during the play also what is happening, if you can analyze yourself, your consciousness becomes so small. You belong to this club, you belong to this party, you belong to this. You have forgotten that you really belong to a higher consciousness, that you belong to the country. You say, no, I belong to this club, so I must make this club win. I belong to India, and then we do all that thing. I belong to. So what it means is, in the play, during the play, our consciousness shrinks. And the shrinking is the cause of all our problems. You see, after the play, once the basketball game is over, the victor and the defeated, they are both announced. They come back home and say, "Yeah, we had a lovely game." You shake hands, we go and have a common dinner. This is, and why does it happen? Because after the play, immediately our consciousness expands. During the play, we shrink, and when we shrink, we have all the struggle, all the enmity, all the violence, and all that. But when it expands, even it's a very common experience. We don't have to really go into the ultimate experience, is very simple day-to-day truth that the shrinking of the consciousness is the main source, cause of all our problems. You go to Matra Mandir, you meditate there, you see there's an expansion of consciousness. You forget your enemies, you forget your friends, you forget everything. And the expansion of consciousness, you identify with something expansive. Like the mother gave us a simple exercise. She said, you go and lie down on your terrace and look at the stars. Or you sit at the ocean, on the beach, look at the waves. So this is the other way of expanding consciousness. That is, if you sit in front of the vastness of the sky, of the stars, of the ocean, so that vastness itself gets into you and makes your mind vast and calm and peaceful. So if you don't want to, if you have a problem in sitting in meditation, because meditation is fundamentally expansion of consciousness. Why do people go to the forest and to the mountains and to the higher ranges? Because the nature of the vastness helps you to meditate in the sense that you also become vast. So here we see the same analysis. All these are, however, figures and appearances, and whatever he does, it must be in himself, because he has nowhere else to do it, since he is all space and all time. Realize therefore that all these around you, wife, children, friends, enemies, men, animals, animate things and inanimate, are in you, the universal mind, like actors on a stage, and seem to be outside you only for appearance's sake, for the convenience of the play. You see, that's what I was quoting you, for the convenience of the play. You see here, a very apt example he gives. Let me give you the thought first. It says all these creations, all this multiplicity, all this enmity, all these players, all these relations, are they anything outside of the divine? No. Because the divine being everything, there cannot be anything outside. Yes, try to understand this extraordinary logic here. Logic and of course the spiritual experience. But on the mental level also, you can understand if everything is in the divine and is the divine, how can there be anything outside? So similarly, if I say all these are my relations, my consciousness, you and the chair and the building and the sun and the lion and the tiger, that's me, myself. That's the truth, because if I am the Brahman, all these things cannot be outside of me. They are all within me. They are all my mental consciousness, part of my mental consciousness, spiritual consciousness. And it only says, for the sake, and seem to be outside you only for appearance's sake. And then it says, for the convenience of the play. So, as I explained to you, that the truth is that, but for the convenience, as I told you, for the basketball game, I had to divide my group into 2 or 3, so that there could be a basketball games competition among 4 teams. But once the competitions are over, they are all back to one group. Similarly, we are all giving different duties, different functions, different faces, different projects, different monies, for the sake of the play. But once we realize, or he will tell you next line, that if we realize that all this is only for the sake of the play, why are we taking it so seriously? So this is one thought that we should always keep in mind, that this is only a temporary thing, this is only a temporary arrangement that has been made for the sake of the play. For 1 hour of basketball, for the 23 hours we are together, actually we are one. So this is the understanding of looking at life, looking at relations, looking at all the problems. Then you see your problems will decrease, your suffering will decrease, everything decreases. And you say, no, after all, This is only a temporary thing. This is only not, it's not going to last me all my life. It's there for that 1 hour basketball play. So he says, therefore then he says, the example now he brings it, he says, all this is like actors on a stage and seem to be outside you only for the sake of appearance. If you realize this, you will be angry with none, therefore you will hate none, and therefore you will try to injure none. For how can you be angry with any? If your enemies injure you, it is yourself who are injuring yourself. Whatever they are, you have made them that. Whatever they do, you are the root of their action. Nor will you injure them, because you will be injuring none but yourself. Why indeed should you hate them and try to injure them any more than Shakespeare hated Iago for injuring Othello? Do you think that Shakespeare shared the feelings of Lodovico when he condemned the successful villain to death and torture? If Shakespeare did hate Iago, you would at once say that it was illusion, avidya, on the part of Shakespeare, since it is Shakespeare himself who set Iago there to injure Othello, since indeed there is no Othello or Iago, but only Shakespeare creating himself in himself. That's a brilliant analysis, example you should understand. From there is a beautiful analysis for giving the Vedanta. Now Iago and Othello, well, I don't know if we know the stories, you remember? I mean, Iago is the villain, Othello is the hero, well, I remember better Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. Whatever, there is always the villain, the one who murders the king or something. Now Sri Aurobindo is explaining, does Shakespeare really hate Iago? Or does he really love Othello? Because who created Iago? It is Shakespeare. Who created Othello? It is Shakespeare. But for the drama to be very dramatic, he made Iago so villainous, and he made in that Lady Macbeth story, who is that fellow who asked for a pound of flesh? Shylock. Shylock is Merchant of Venice. Merchant of Venice, sorry. Shylock in Merchant of Venice. He is such a criminal, we hate him. It's a my God who says, I want a pound of flesh from nearest his heart. But then does Shakespeare hate Shylock? Or does he love, what's that hero? Merchant of Venice? Bassanio. And does he bring in the great Portia, that young little the judge? Just all these are made, that is Shakespeare himself is creating Portia or Iago or Bassanio or Shylock. But for him, they are his creations. So he doesn't hate anybody or love anybody. In fact, not only his creations, they are himself.
He is speaking.
When he is writing the speech of Shylock, it is Shakespeare who is writing. When he is speaking Portia, let mercy be on thyself, O great mercy descend, it is Shakespeare. It is the same Macbeth, it is the same Othello. So he says, if you understand this creation through this analysis of Shakespeare, it is exactly the same thing, the divine. That we are all himself fully. You see, when he writes about the Shakespeare, I don't know, it's been too long back, that Julius Caesar, the great speech, what is it called? When he says, I come here not to praise Caesar, but Antonio, Mark Antonio. But that is a wonderful speech. Who is that? It's Shakespeare, who is inspiring. But who is the fellow who said, Et tu Brutus? Brutus killed, what is his name? Caesar. I mean, it's brilliant. This Shakespeare example is really, it goes really into your mind. He is the Brutus, he is Bassanio, he is Caesar, but who has enjoyed? Who is the real enjoyer? Shakespeare. When he's killing Othello, or when he's killing Caesar, when he's doing Mark Antonio, and then he is fully each one of them. The beauty is that he's fully himself. He's not saying, no, 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 I must have a better word for Othello or for King Caesar or Julius Caesar. I'll keep a better speech for him. No, he doesn't keep that better speech for him. Mark Antonio is a brilliant speech. The world has memorized his speech, that I come not to kill Caesar, whatever. So that is exactly this world, that the divine is each one of us fully playing himself fully, and the only enjoyer is he. Because at every moment, that's why we say live in the present. Shakespeare perhaps was not even thinking what will happen with the Julius Caesar speech. When he was writing Mark Antonio, he was full of himself, full of the best of the word, best of the language, best of the imagery. And then maybe, I'm sure, he went and had a cup of coffee, and then he said, okay, let me come back. And when he wrote Caesar, he forgot what he wrote about Mark Antonio. He wrote the complete speech of Caesar. So this is the reality. That is, no, please. That is the will. That is the will of the divine. Every minute, he is there in each one of us fully. This is the play. So now, it's the players who may be hating each other, Caesar and Othello and King Lear, but the dramatist, he doesn't hate anybody, he doesn't love anybody, because he cannot. You see, when you say love and hate, that means they're two different persons, but here, where is the two different persons? It's the same Shakespeare here and there, both of them full. So Sri Aurobindo would say, this is exactly what is happening in the Vedanta. He says, why then should you consider your hatred of yourself made enemy more reasonable than Shakespeare's hatred of his own creation? No, all things being in yourself are your own creation, are yourself, and you cannot hate your own creation, you cannot loathe yourself. I mean, now slowly he is coming to one of the most brilliant analysis you will see. You see, I mean, how this simple Vedanta can be applicable to our life once we realize that the Brahman is everything, that the Supreme is me, I am Brahmasmi. I mean, this mantra is getting more and more into my mind, and I see the truth of that I am Brahmasmi. So what an extraordinary philosophy, extraordinary moral principle, extraordinary way of being alive. That through situations, through life, if I say I am the Brahman, you are the Brahman, how can I hate? Because we are not separate. I cannot hate myself. Then he says, I cannot loathe myself. Loathing and hatred are children of illusion, of ignorance. This is the negative side of morality. But there is a positive for which the Shruti next proceeds to lay down the basis. You must, for the purpose of withdrawing yourself from unrealities, see all creatures in the self, but if you did that only, you would soon arrive at the nirvana of all action and ring down the curtain on an unfinished play. That is our master, He is brilliant in that. He says, fine, if you see now this question of seeing the Brahman everywhere and everything and all that, what will happen? He says it will all ring down nirvana of all action. A brilliant thing. He says, then if I am Brahman, you are Brahman, he is Brahman, then why should we quarrel, why should we think? We'll all sit at home and quietly we say, no problems, no enmities, no action. It will be nirvana action, means suspension of action. There is no dynamism. Everything you say, is inshallah, as you said, God's grace, will of the Lord, chalne do chal raha, whatever is happening, why should I make any effort to progress, any effort to do this? He says, this will land us in, the curtain will ring down the curtain of an unfinished play. So this is the negative aspect. I says, look at the positive. For the purpose of continuing the play till the proper time, for your final exit, you must also see yourself in all creatures. This is the underlying thing. The first part is, if you see Brahman in everything, it's an extraordinary way. But the danger is that you may become actionless. Because you kind of, give up. Saying, fine, if Brahman is doing, fine, I'll see. But then it says, the second part is, that it says, you must also see yourself in all creatures. The nature of the self in a state of Vidya is bliss. Now the state of Vidya is a state of self-realization, the realization of oneness and universality. The nature of the self in the state of Avidya, the false sense of diversity and limitation, is a state not of pure bliss, but of pleasure and pain. For pleasure is different from bliss, as it is limited and involves pain, while the nature of bliss is illimitable and above duality. It is when pain itself becomes pleasure, is swallowed up in pleasure, that bliss is born. Everything, therefore, which removes even partially the sense of difference and helps towards the final unity, brings with it a touch of bliss by a partial oblivion of pain. That's the line to be underlined. You see, what's the philosophy? The philosophy is the false sense of diversity and limitation is a state not of pure bliss but of pleasure and pain. Now he is giving us another aspect, that when I see myself in all things, first one was as I was trying to see the Brahman in all things. The second state is when you see yourself in all creatures, what is the psychological effect? You see, if I see myself in difference with you, division with you, then the inevitable result is pleasure and pain, hatred and love, sorrow and suffering. Because the more we have divisive consciousness, the more we have sorrow and suffering. It is inevitable, inseparable. But the more you have the sense of unity, the more you will get bliss. Bliss is that consciousness of oneness. In fact, he would tell us later that the very fact that you when you have a great joy, great blissful moment, when is it? If you analyze that moment of bliss is the moment of unity, the moment of union. That's what is called bliss. But the moment there is any divisiveness, you may have immediately the bliss falls down to the level of pleasure and pain, sorrow and suffering. Because all these divisive experiences belong to this divisive consciousness. So simple this line that I said, he said, everything therefore which removes even partially, remember the word partially, even partially the sense of difference and helps toward the final unity, brings with it a touch of bliss. And another word that you should remember is, it says, helps towards the final unity. You see, you may say, okay, we are friends now, but we are not yet gone beyond our enmity. But even that the gesture of saying, okay, now we are friends, we'll try not to be enemies tomorrow or from day after tomorrow. But this gesture of oneness, even momentarily, which may help furthering the ultimate unity. Maybe after 3 years you are getting united, you become friends again, you love each other. So any movement towards unity, any movement, it says, taking away the difference, is bound to bring bliss. It says, is a touch of bliss by a partial oblivion of pain. But that which brings you bliss, you cannot help but delight in ecstatically, you cannot help but love. This is the very fundamental philosophy again, that look at the logic. He says, the consciousness of oneness, the consciousness of unity, even if it is partial, temporary, for the present. Sense of unity brings you bliss, and that which brings you bliss, obviously you fall in love with that. You see, that which brings you joy and bliss, you begin to love. He says, but delight in ecstatically you cannot help but love. If therefore you see yourself in another, you spontaneously love that other, for in yourself you must delight. If you see yourself in all creatures, you cannot but love all creatures. So you see, we have a beautiful connection between love and unity and bliss and beauty. So what your 5 sons of poetry is this connection, that wherever there is unity, there is bliss. Wherever there is bliss, there is delight. Wherever there is delight, there is love. So any movement in our ordinary, common, day-to-day life, if we can have touches of unity, automatically, because remember, the fundamental line is unity. It is unity that brings bliss. It is unity that brings delight. It is unity that brings love. So now we understand the grand concept of unity. And now what is this unity? Unity is nothing but the fundamental consciousness that you are the Brahman, that the divine is in all and I am the divine. That ultimate sense of oneness. So whenever we move towards that, we may not be realizing it. But every moment in every act, if I can emphasize unity, it gives you a touch of bliss, it gives you a glimpse of delight, it gives you a touch of love. So you see the beautiful sequence of consciousness. So how and why we should not have disunity, quarrels and problems and ego senses, ego this thing, anywhere and everywhere. The moment there is division, then there's the opposite happen. Unity brings bliss and delight and love. Disunity will bring you sorrow and pleasure and hatred. So it's such a logical thing. So you see the use of the Vedanta, the philosophy of the Vedanta, how if it is practiced, that brings in really the source of human love of everything. So we may go from you cannot go from love towards unity. You have to go from unity which brings love. It's not that I'm here, I love the human beings, I love my wife, I love my child. In fact, the famous thing in this Upanishad, I love my wife not because she is my wife, but we are the one same Atman. You see that unity. Because of that unity of our consciousness, that I love my wife. So everywhere the most fundamental principle of this creation is unity. So when the mother speaks about Auroville and unity and human unity, it's not a phrase, it's not just a political ideal of a city. It is the Vedantic ideal that the whole creation began out of the unity, out of the oneness into the many, and the manyness is going back to the oneness. So all that we are doing is a practical, political, physiological, social, environmental, you have nomenclatures plenty. But the essence is nothing but the Vedanta. So you see, some of us think, oh no, Sri Aurobindo and Vedanta are different, I am interested in Sri Aurobindo, not Vedanta. You see, where is the difference? In fact, the whole of Auroville I can explain only fully in the terms of Vedanta. You see, this page tells you the origin and the aim of Auroville, philosophic explanation of why Auroville. You see, you have all the practical things, you can have 120 projects, I don't mind. But what is the nature and the essence of this project should be? Unity. And it's this unity that will bring you the delight, that will bring you the bliss, for which we are all hungering. I want love, I want this, I am not happy. And so you would say, if you see yourself in all creatures, you cannot but love all creatures. Universal love is the inevitable consequence of the realization of the one in many. And with universal love, how shall any shred of hate, disgust, dislike, loathing coexist? They dissolve in it like the night mists in the blaze of the risen sun. So we see now, this is the truth of the Vedanta, that ultimate oneness of consciousness. That I am that Brahman, and Brahman is me, I am the Brahman. So you may say it's high philosophy, but he has given us on the practical level the attempt for unity is the basis of all our joy, our bliss, of our love, of everything. So we may not practice that there are all the commandments in the world, do this, love thy neighbor and all that. All commandments. But the Advaitic commandment is attempt unity at any cost. Be it family, be it society, be it nation, be it everywhere. So on one side we say we want happiness, we want love, we want all that. But on the other side we constantly are dividing ourselves, hating each other. So last sentence, the one I would repeat is, if you see yourself in all creatures, you cannot but love all creatures. So these are the two things that we have from the Vedanta, that Aham Brahmasmi and Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. So these are the two mantras. That I am the Brahman is that individual perfection, that individual consciousness of unity. And if one that comes, then Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, then the whole society, whole world becomes one family. That is the unity again. So unity in the individual, unity in the collectivity. So the mantric word is the unity. And of that, Auroville is just the beginning of a great attempt. So what the mother said, we say is the mother's dream, you can see is the divine dream, why it is. Because it all started from the one to the many, and now with the mother and Sri Aurobindo, that journey back has become a conscious journey back. All these days, nature was pulling us back towards the divine through its evolutionary process. But now nature and Mother and Sri Aurobindo are giving us a chance to consciously move back. So that is the main thing, unity. Rest will follow automatically. Yeah, so we'll continue for our next time.